support of the Western world. And that's what he was playing for. He expected that the US administration will turn its back on Ukraine and that there will be a huge fragility within the European Union, which we actually witness right now, okay? Undecisiveness, never-ending talk shops. And in this way, this kind of the war of attrition will deliver the best result for Putin, which is Ukraine and the restoration of the Soviet Union. And last but not least, you've just mentioned Putin, I mean Russia. Yeah. That it is Russia that is waging the war. Let me provide you with the bigger scope. It is not Russia. This is an international conflict. China is providing a lifeline to Russia. China is supporting this war. China is an accomplice in this war. China is a key partner of North Korea that deployed its troops against Ukraine and provides an ammo in this war against Ukraine. China is an ally to Iran. So, given that, look, China, Russia, and another pariahs, they present a totalitarian regime that is fighting against the democracy and the free world. So this is the definition of this conflict. It is not just Russo-Ukrainian war. It is bigger.
Yes. Thanks for bringing that perspective. And now, if Kira, I ask you the same question, but more building on Arseniy's response, how can we change the calculus on Putin in this war through hard power, if it's not through negotiations and appealing to the costs that he is already encountering? I remember I was told at the beginning of the war by one of the East European foreign ministers that he thought if Russians would lose 500,000 men in Ukraine, they would end the war. But I said, surely Russians are counting losses more in tanks and in equipment than in men. And we are not inflicting high enough damage to Russia. So what it is that could either deny Russia capability to wage the war or change its calculus?
Well, sadly, in spite of all the evidence, the idea that this war can be brought to an end through negotiations refuses to die. I lost count of the number of times I was doing media interviews over a period of extended months asking me to comment on the peace talks, quote unquote, the negotiations. And when I said, what negotiations? They are not happening. There is no point of contact. There is no discussion that is actually going to lead to any kind of outcome that you have in mind. Everybody was terribly confused because the presentation of what Russia was doing was not just for the audience of Trump. It also was very natural for global media to engage in this process and pretend that something was happening. But it was well before the end of 2022 that the then Ukrainian commander, Valery Zaluzhny, identified that the center of gravity for confronting Russia was, in fact, bringing it home to ordinary Russians, that the war was not something that was being waged on their behalf a long way away for exterminating Ukrainians that we can all cheer and it won't affect us, but would in fact affect Ukrainian society and
Russian society.
Excuse me, Russian society. And the calculus behind that is that the only way to induce the Russian leadership to end the war is to present a challenge which is a threat to that grip on power of Vladimir Putin. Now, this is something which we see Ukraine developing on a daily basis, bringing home to ordinary Russians that this affects them, for example, by making sure that they cannot buy petrol to fuel their cars. But it's also
that is already happening to a degree.
Exactly. It's also something which Ukraine's foremost Western backers were trying hard to oppose under the previous US administration, for example, that had reached the conclusion, partly as a result of how Russia was presenting this war, reached the conclusion that it was more dangerous to allow Russia to be defeated than for a neighbor of Russia to be destroyed. And that is still a mental block that it is hard for some backers of Ukraine to overcome. Is it possible to defeat Russia? Of course it is. Will people do it? That's a whole other question. Whether there is the will across Europe to actually recognize what is at stake and take steps accordingly is a whole other question. Now, we know what Russia is concerned about. Let's look at what's been happening in Denmark over the course of this month. Denmark identifies what it is that deters Russia, long-range precision strike, to hold at risk things that matter to Russia. Russia has hysterics as a result. starts the nuclear threats, and then a few days later, drones mysteriously appear over Copenhagen Airport. We know this matters to them because not only of the concepts of deterrence and war termination that they have written about at enormous length over the previous decade, but also how they react when it happens. So it can be done. The question is, will it?
Yeah, and just to bring in the question from James Nixie, the former director of Russia and Eurasia, he says, good morning to all of you, gentlemen and ladies, and the question is a bit hypothetical, and he understands that, you know, it's a speculative alternative history, but what might have been, what would our world look like today if Ukraine were provided all the necessary military kit, the Taurus, tank-stopping landmines, air protection, possibly the Sky Shield that there has been a discussion a lot. Could we be bringing Ukrainian victory closer?
Well, let's take it back even further than that. Because what if in October, November of 2021, when Western powers were fully aware what Russia was planning, they had decided, instead of deciding that there was nothing they could do about it, to actually do something.
Yes.
If there had been the kind of support for Ukraine that was designed to deter Russia from attacking, as opposed to the endless diplomatic processions to Moscow to try to cajole President Putin out of doing something that he had his mind set on by saying, we know exactly what you're going to do, but we're not actually going to do anything to stop you, then we could possibly have had the start of the process, the long process of turning Russia into a country that is deterred and has had boundaries set for its behavior. And that is the only way we are, over the long term, going to remove the only hard security threat to the European continent. But instead, that process did not start, and so Russia continues the pattern of its post-colonial wars, bringing it what looks like success on Russian terms. Until that changes, this will never stop, and until Russia itself changes, we are always going to have this problem.
And that actually, I want to bring Arseniy because I would even go further to October 2021, but to a spring of 2014 when Russians invaded Crimea in the first place. And we do know now from open archives and sources that Americans were openly dissuading Ukrainians from mounting resistance, and the price that Russia paid for that great transgression of international law was non-existent, to be honest. So, I mean, Arseniy, what do you think at that time, back from 2014 to 2021, was stopping Western partners of Ukraine, if you can call them like that, to actually see that if Ukraine is not armed, you remember the whole discussion about whether Ukraine should and shouldn't be given lethal weapons. We are far away from that, but it was the case. Could Ukraine be given lethal weapons to defend itself? This was a legitimate question all over the media. What did you hear then from Ukraine, from Berlin, from Paris, from London, and how did that lead to where we are today?
You know, I admire all these ifs and buts, but here is the thing: we don't have the time machine.
Yeah.
So we can draw the lessons out of what has happened a decade ago. Because let me remind you that this war has been going on for 11 years, but not for 3.5 years. Putin illegally invaded Crimea in 2014. And there was no political will on the side of our allies to provide Ukraine either with a lethal weapon or to give a real membership perspective in NATO for Ukraine. I was the Speaker of the House in 2008, and I hosted the then President of the United States in Kiev, who did everything in order to get this map. But in the end, in Bucharest, we were refused to get map for Ukraine.
Membership action plan for NATO.
Yeah, membership action plan for NATO. It's a kind of entrance to NATO. What happened in the end? Putin invaded Georgia and moved to Crimea and to the east of Ukraine. So let me put it this way. We are well aware this inconsistency and a lack of guts and balls drive us to the situation where we are right now. Right now, we are at an inflection point. The price is skyrocketing if we waste the time and if we drag our feet. So here is the lesson. If the West decides, I mean the West the US administration, the European Union, and the UK, and I really commend the United Kingdom. Yesterday I met your former Chief of Defense, Admiral Radakin. Your decision to provide Storm Shadow missiles and Challenger tanks to Ukraine was a sea change. It was a game changer in the decision-making process of the entire West. So here is the thing, what is needed? So first, we need an additional security supplemental for Ukraine from the US administration and from the European Union. Second, we need to get a real financial support. The budget gap is around $170 billion in the